Well, that day I was working at Choice Vend in Windsor Locks, which ran off of Route 75, which is pretty much where the tornado had touched down that day. Earlier in the day, we had absolutely no warning what was going on. It had been black outside, so we knew that it was raining. And our emergency lighting in the plant where I was working had came on. And I remember the group was pretty happy about that. They were clapping because we thought that that would be it for the end of the day, and we had lost power somehow. A few minutes later, the lights had come back on, and you could hear boos throughout the assembly area because it came on. And then very shortly after that, I remember hearing a roar. It was like a runaway freight train, and it was really, really loud. The emergency lighting popped back on again, and then within seconds, the roof of our building had peeled open like a can opener, and the things were falling off of the ceiling. Water started pouring in. Everybody ran in all kinds of different directions to try to get away from everything that was falling out of the ceiling. And I can remember running into the refrigeration department at that time because they only had one door that was there. Don't forget, we were working in an assembly building with no windows, so you couldn't really see what was happening outside. So we ran over to that door to see what was happening, and I had gotten to the door. Just as I got there, we saw some cars that were shaking and lifting and turning over, and people were trying to get out of the building. No one really knew which way to go and where to go. At that point, I had run to the front office area, and it was at that time we had discovered that some of the office girls that were working there had been injured by flying glass. It was these huge plate glass windows that blew out, and they blew right in on the women that were working there. And I can remember one woman was severely cut, and she was placed on the desk, and they were attending to her wounds. And making my way out of the office to the personnel office area, I looked outside once again, and I noticed there was a car that was out there, and the engine had been running. And I walked outside, and, of course, the tornado was done by then. And there was a woman that was in the car. She was over there picking up her husband for after work. And she had hit the floor with a little baby, and she had a baby with her, and they were at the bottom of the car on the deck. And we got them out, and there was a little cut on the baby's head. And I never forget it. There was a little tiny piece of glass in the baby's head, and I plucked it out of there. And then the mom just put her finger over the little cut. They were unharmed. It was amazing.
So let's focus a little bit on that for a second. When you saw the car out there, I mean, what was she doing? Was she in shock? What was she doing?
Well, you could tell that there was actually, the car was actually running, so you knew someone might have been in it or maybe ran out of it. But when I had gotten over to it, all the windows were smashed out of the car. She was on the floor of the car with the baby, and the baby was crying, and she was shaking and whimpering because she had just lived through that. And when we got out of there, she was still shaking, and she was very appreciative that we had helped her out of the car, and she was hugging people, and, we started talking about what had happened. And it was shortly right after there that somebody had come over from the building next door to us. It was called WTC Air Freight at the time. And the WTC Air Freight place had lost most of its walls, and all of its trailers were tipped over at the time. And they came over and said that somebody needed first aid in there and wanted to know if anybody knew any first aid. At that time, back in '79, I had gone to college at Springfield Technical Community, and I wanted to be a paramedic, so I had learned a little bit. And I walked across the street, and the first thing that I noticed when I walked across the road to go over there was the amount of water that was in the road. It came right up to my knees. I couldn't believe there was so much water in that road, but there was. And we walked across the street, and we went into what I assumed was the reception area of the building, and there was total destruction in there. And the thing that I remember outside of the injuries was when we walked into the place, there was money floating in the water. And I don't know where it came from, but it was all in the water, and no one even thought to even pick it up. It's just something that had stuck in my mind after all these years. I can kind of laugh about it now, but back then, with all of the damage and injured people, you just don't think about that stuff, And I remember there was a gentleman that was, he had been in the restroom when the tornado had hit. You got to remember, no one knew this came upon everyone so quickly that it hit us before anybody knew what was going on. So everybody was pretty much going about their daily business in the assembly areas and WTC air freight. Everyone was just working as if nothing had happened. It really looked to a lot of people as that it was a regular big rainstorm. The only difference was, I recall, is that the sky was green. It was green that day, green and black, something I had never seen before. So it was a little bit different to us. And when we had gotten over to WTC Air Freight, we believed that the man that was in the restroom might have had a broken arm or a shoulder problem because he was in pain. So with all the walls gone and no place to put anybody, there was actually one tractor trailer that was left standing. The tornado had not gotten it. And I don't remember who it was, but somebody said, let's get the people that are injured into that one trailer. You got to remember, we didn't know if this thing was coming back at us. We didn't really understand everything that was happening. So we put several of the people in the one trailer that was there, and most of these people had superficial cuts and things like that. Some of the women were just scared and shaking, and I remember that there was a gentleman walking toward me across the factory floor, and I remember him, he was dazed, and I was like looking at him, and I walked over to him, and I asked him if he was okay, and he looked at me, and he said, I think so, and he didn't look like he had a cut on him, and I couldn't figure out what was wrong with him until we kind of turned him around, and at that time we had realized that a piece of flying glass must have flown right through the air and hit him between the shoulder blades, and it stuck right in. And there was really nothing that we could do because there was no first aid kit. Everything had been destroyed. I remember I sent somebody over to the front of the building to see if they could find whatever first aid kit that they might have had, but there was nothing. Everything was just destroyed and strewn all over the place. So what had happened, we had the people inside of the trailer, and the women that were there, we actually made, some of the women took their shirts off, their jackets, and don't forget it was cold out that day, and they took their jackets off and they took their shirts off, and they started ripping their shirts so we could use it for bandages for some of the people that were bleeding. We didn't have anything. And so we made the people that were cut and shaking and some of the women that were uncontrollably scared and shaken, we made everybody as comfortable as we could. And I remember not long after that, the National Guard came around with a Jeep. And I had told them, there's wounded in the trailer here, and we need to get somebody to help us out. They said they would send somebody as soon as they could, but Route 75 at that time was such a mess. We had no clue, and I don't think the National Guard had a clue how long it was going to take before someone could come there to help these people. I had left the trailer, and there was another gentleman, and with time gone by so many years, I don't recall the gentleman's name, but he stayed in the trailer with the people. And I believe it was not that long after that they had sent someone over there to try to check the people. I believe it was the National Guard and some of their medics that came over to check the people and help them out.
What do you remember? What do you remember about when you were outside? Like, did you look around at the destruction, or were you just focused on, helping the other people?
Well, at the time when we were at WTC Air Freight, we were more concerned with two things. One, the people that were injured, and two, we didn't know where it was to be safe. We didn't know what had hit us at first. We didn't know if something was going to be coming back, or we didn't know where to go. And, after a little bit of time, when I realized that everything was okay and we weren't going to get hit again with something else, that's when a lot of people started walking out. We started coming out of the buildings. We started walking out to Route 75, and then we started to realize that there were the damage in it that was so extensive in that area. Back, I couldn't believe the things that I was looking at, because that day when I had come to work that morning, it's like any other morning. Everything was there that you normally would see every single day, and then all of a sudden, within seconds, what I was looking at was trees that were gone and buildings that were destroyed, hangars fallen down and stripped of their roofs, some completely gone. poles and wires in the street. There were guardrails. I remember guardrails. They were peeled like paper, and they came right off of the posts, and they peeled right around. Big, huge, long sections had peeled around. There were cars that were wrecked and turned over, debris everywhere. You couldn't make this in a Hollywood movie the way that the way that it looked that day after the tornado had hit. And when we're in Route 75, people from everywhere, not only our building, but from different buildings and different places, started gathering out there to try to talk and see what in the heck had hit us, what went on. People really weren't that sure what happened. You know, some people thought it was a big bad storm. Some people thought it was, you know, like we found out later, a tornado. But you've got to remember, it hit us so quickly with no warning. We had no warning back in 1979 that this, not like they do today with the Doppler radar and everything. We had no warning at all. It hit us and jumped on us, I mean, that quickly. And people were just kind of walking around and taking in the scenes. There were people that were still, you know, obviously scared, didn't know what was going on. And the first thing that I thought of after I was out on the street was my wife. I had only been married a year back in 1979, and I thought to myself, you know, she's going to be wicked worried about what's going on. I mean, it was already past the time that I would be home from work, and I had no way to get in touch with her at that time. Everything was down and out. So a bunch of us had gotten together and said, well, let's see if we can't walk down Route 75 and see if we can't find a phone. And as we were walking down Route 75, that's when we saw, you know, even more damage. But I think the thing that really surprised me was you would walk down Route 75, you would see an area of destruction on one side and an area that nothing was touched on another side. It was absolutely amazing. I remember there was a gas station that was there, and the gas station was open. It's as if nothing happened to it. The only thing that happened was the sign out front was blown down. Other than that, the building wasn't touched, but yet the building next to it was destroyed. And I always think to this day, you know, how that could happen, but I guess that's part of the tornado from what they tell me. So we had come across at that time they had an outdoor air museum, which was, I believe it was still called the New England Air Museum. And they had an outdoor exhibit of many, many planes out there. And I used to take my nephews there, and I even went down there with my 1-year-old son. And I couldn't believe the devastation of that air museum. It had taken big, huge planes, heavy, big, huge planes, and tossed them all over the place and picked them up and threw them down, and it had destroyed quite a few of those airplanes that were in that outdoor air museum. I couldn't believe the damage that had been done in that area. Just kind of tossed those planes around like they were matchbook toys. So we continued to walk down Route 75. I think there were 5 or 6 of us in a group, and we were still looking for some place to find a phone. And we would stop at some place, and then they would say, no, we got no power, we got no phones, no anything. So we continued to walk down Route 75 and saw some of the damage. And as we got further away from the airport in the area where the tornado had hit, you could start to see that there was a little bit less damage. But then in some areas when you came across it, there was a lot of damage. And I don't know how long we walked. I swear I think we must have walked 5 or 6 miles. And we came across a state cop, and he was trying to direct people around. And I remember at that time I had asked him if he could get some information back to my wife. I said, you know, she's not going to know what's going on. But I think at the time they were just so overwhelmed, and, you know, he said, I'll try to do what I can, but right now we're just so busy with everything else and trying to worry about the injured and the possible dead in the area. You know, my wife never did get a call. And I can remember that we were walking in a residential area, and I don't exactly remember where it was or what street we turned down. Once again, those things are lost in time. But I do remember there was a line of people outside of a home, and I thought it was a little bit funny. And I said to the group, I said, why are all these people standing in front of the house? And we walked down, and as we got closer, we found out that this woman had the only working phone in the area. Everything was knocked out. For whatever reason, her phone worked. And she was a sweet lady, and she let all these people, including myself, make a phone call home to their loved ones or their wives or their moms, dads, whatever. And at that time, I finally got my chance to get in touch with my wife to tell her that I was okay. She had seen it on the news back in Massachusetts, and unfortunately, what they showed on the news at that time was our building and the building next to it. And she knew I had worked there, so of course she had panicked and got excited and called our whole family to tell them what was going on. They all met at my house at the time. And I told her I was all right, but I wasn't sure exactly when I would be home. And now that tornado hit at 2:59 p.m. that day, and I never made it home that day until at night. I believe it was around 8:25. I finally got home. I was able to get out of the area, and things were starting to move. Cars were starting to get through, and that's basically it. That was a day in my life I'll never forget.
Wow. One thing that we didn't talk about yesterday was tell me what it was like in the days afterwards, going back to work. Tell me a little bit about that cleanup effort.
Well, there were a lot of curious people, and the next day, I even told my wife, I jumped in my car. I wanted to go down again the day after I had a chance to relax and everything and look at the damage again. At that time, they had Route 75 blocked off, and I got through because I told them I was working at Choice Vend and I needed to get down there. And he let me through, but really our building had been closed down because our roof was gone. But I wanted to see the damage for myself. So that next day I actually went down there, and it's funny because there was a lot of people that were down there surveying the damage. And again, I got a chance to just look at different areas and things that I had seen that day. And, you just look at that and you take it all in. You still can't believe, what your eyes are seeing. You can't believe the devastation, that Mother Nature caused that day. And I think the thing that really sticks in my mind, and I know I've mentioned it before, is the fact that we had no warning. There was no warning. No one got a warning to say, look, we've got a tornado coming in, or take cover, or take shelter. It just hit us that quickly at 2:59. And it, hopefully no one will ever be in a tornado, but if you ever have, the sound that it makes is something that you never forget. It's very hard to put a thumbnail on exactly what it sounds like, but the best way that I can describe it, as I did before, it sounds like a bunch of freight trains coming over you. And it's just a sound that has stuck with me all these years. The power of what these tornadoes can do is absolutely amazing. I don't recall exactly what the category tornado was that hit us that day, but I know the winds were well over, I think anyway, 140, 150 miles an hour, to do that type of damage. And it's just something that after all these years, it's 2019, this was 1979, that I remember it vividly. I mean, if you ask me who I worked with 3 years ago, I can't remember, but this tornado, I can tell you everything about it because I lived it.
Do you have any, do you get nervous? Were you nervous about weather following that incident?
It's funny. I around here in Massachusetts, we've had a couple of tornado warnings, since then. And it's funny because that didn't scare me. When they gave me the warning and said, oh, you could have this, or be careful, or look out for this, I knew it was going to be coming, and it didn't bother me at all. I lived through one that I had no warning. So I said to myself, I've been through this one in 79. What they're telling me about now doesn't really scare me. I've already been through it before. If that makes sense to you. Yeah, it's a feeling that, I'm not, I can't vouch for anybody, but for me, once you've lived through something like that, when you have the weather that they talk about around here, anyway, in Massachusetts, with some high winds and, 40-mile-an-hour gusts, that just doesn't bother me. It doesn't, because, the difference between a 40-mile-an-hour gust and what we lived through that day in 79 is like apples and oranges. Yeah. I think the thing that I would have to say is I was very surprised and happy with the way the response people had turned out, between the National Guard, the Windsor Locks police, fire department and all that. They acted very quickly. They were honest very quickly, and they were very helpful in dealing with whatever injured people that not only we had, but other areas that had injuries. And I think that the response time back in those days, I think, was pretty darn good. And I think everybody did a good job. The thing that you think about when you're going through a catastrophe like that is, how are people going to react? How are people going to handle things? And I think that we handled it pretty good that day. I think that through all in all and all of the devastation, people got together, they came together, they worked together, they cried together, we talked together, we hung out together, and it goes to show that when there is something like that, people can pull together. I mean, you're looking at people that don't even know each other, that were hugging each other and comforting each other and helping each other, and I think that really shows what the American people are all about.